What if the grand streets of Richmond once echoed with choices that shaped the fate of millions? Welcome to Robert's History. I'm Robert, and today we step back into Virginia at a turning point that changed America forever. If you value thoughtful human stories from the past, please consider subscribing and joining our community. Some visuals in this video are symbolic and may not perfectly match every detail, and I truly appreciate your understanding. I hope this journey offers you reflection, perspective, and a quiet moment to connect with history. In 1860, Virginia stood at the height of a system built on human bondage. By then, centuries of tobacco farming had exhausted much of the soil, and the state's economy shifted in a stark and troubling direction. The most profitable commodity was no longer a crop, it was people. Nearly 500,000 enslaved men, women, and children lived in Virginia at that time. The state became a major supplier for the expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South, feeding the domestic slave trade that moved human beings across state lines in forced migrations. Women's bodies were exploited to sustain this system. Children inherited the status of their mothers under the legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, ensuring slavery reproduced itself. Law and custom worked together to protect slaveholders' power, creating a rigid racial hierarchy that defined freedom and bondage at birth. In 1860, Richmond was not just another southern city. It was the largest slave market in Virginia and the second largest in the United States, surpassed only by New Orleans. When we talk about the domestic slave trade, we are not speaking in abstract terms. We are speaking about a real urban center where human beings were appraised, confined, and sold within sight of government buildings and busy commercial streets. Franklin Street became one of the most active auction corridors in the country. Traders displayed enslaved men, women, and children before buyers who examined them as property. Contemporary records and advertisements confirm how routine these sales had become. Close to these auction houses stood facilities known as slave jails. One of the most infamous was Lumpkin's Jail, where people were imprisoned while awaiting sale or transport. Conditions were harsh, and separation from family members was common. Richmond also functioned as a logistical hub. From its rail lines, roads, and river access points, enslaved people were transported to the expanding cotton regions of the Deep South. Historians estimate that hundreds of thousands were forcibly relocated through the domestic trade over decades, and Richmond was central to that network. After Virginia joined the Confederacy in 1861, Richmond became the Confederate capital. That shift gave the city even greater symbolic weight. It stood not only as a marketplace for slavery, but as the political heart of a government formed to defend and preserve it. By 1860, slavery in Virginia shaped every layer of society. It created a rigid class structure that defined power, opportunity, and even identity. At the top stood the planter elite, wealthy landowners whose fortunes were built on enslaved labor. They held political influence, controlled vast estates, and set the cultural tone of the state. Their lifestyle projected refinement and authority, yet it rested on a system of enforced bondage. Below them were poorer white Virginians. Many did not own slaves, yet the economy still revolved around slavery. Their work, wages, and social standing were tied to a system that concentrated wealth at the top. Even those without direct ownership often supported the structure because it preserved a racial hierarchy that placed them above black Virginians. At the bottom were enslaved black men, women, and children who were denied basic civil rights. They could not vote, testify freely in court, or legally protect their own families. The law defined them as property, not citizens. Family separation was one of the most painful realities. Husbands, wives, and children could be sold away to settle debts or increase profit. Enslaved women and girls were especially vulnerable to exploitation, and historical records document patterns of abuse that were rarely punished. When we look at this period honestly, we see not just an economic system, but a society structured around inequality and control. Yet even within this oppressive world, enslaved people in Virginia built a culture that endured. This is something I always want us to pause and consider. Human beings stripped of legal rights still created meaning, community, and hope. Music became one of the most powerful expressions of that resilience. Spirituals and work songs were not only acts of faith, they carried coded messages, emotional release, and quiet resistance. Lyrics about deliverance or crossing over often held deeper meanings for those who sang them. In fields and gatherings, music became both prayer and protection. When open worship was restricted, many gathered secretly in wooded areas known as hush harbors. There, beyond direct supervision, they blended Christian teachings with African spiritual traditions. These meetings offered space to grieve, to encourage one another, and to imagine freedom in a society that denied it. Food tells a similar story. Enslaved families were often given leftover cuts and limited rations. From these scraps, they developed what later became known as soul food, a cuisine rooted in adaptation and creativity. Resistance also took many forms. Some worked slowly or damaged tools to disrupt production. Others sought freedom through escape, like Henry Box Brown, who mailed himself to the North in 1849. Armed resistance also shaped Virginia's history, from Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 to John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859. These acts remind us that slavery was never passively accepted. When war came in 1861, Virginia moved from being the heart of the slave trade to becoming the heart of the Confederacy itself. Richmond was chosen as the Confederate capital, placing the city at the political center of a government formed to protect slavery. That decision ensured Virginia would not remain on the sidelines. It became one of the primary battlegrounds of the American Civil War. Major campaigns tore across its landscape. Battles such as the Wilderness and Petersburg brought immense destruction to towns, farms, and families. If you visit these places today, the quiet fields can feel almost unreal when you remember how much blood was shed there. Virginia carried the weight of that conflict more than most states. The war also split the state geographically and politically. The northwestern counties, where slavery was less central to the economy, rejected secession. In 1863, they were admitted to the Union as West Virginia, permanently dividing the old Commonwealth. For enslaved people, the war created both danger and possibility. Many fled toward Union lines whenever they could, seeking protection. After the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, black enlistment increased dramatically. By the end of the war, roughly 180,000 African American men had served in the United States colored troops, including many from Virginia. Their service transformed the war into a fight not only for union, but for liberation. Slavery formally ended with the 13th Amendment in December 1865. The turning point was not sudden or simple, but it marked the collapse of a system that had shaped Virginia for generations. After 1865, Virginia entered a period of profound uncertainty. The slave economy that had shaped its identity for generations collapsed almost overnight. The auction houses on Franklin Street fell silent. Slave jails, such as Lumpkin's Jail, closed their doors. A trade that had once generated enormous wealth simply ceased to exist. For many white Virginians, this meant financial upheaval. For formerly enslaved people, it meant legal freedom, but not immediate security. The federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau, operating from 1865 to 1872 to assist those emerging from slavery. The Bureau distributed food, clothing, and medical aid in communities struggling with poverty and wartime devastation. Education became one of its most lasting contributions. Schools were founded across the state, often with the support of Northern aid societies and local black communities. Men and women of all ages sought literacy, knowing that reading and writing were essential tools for citizenship and self-determination. Yet freedom did not erase hostility. Many white leaders resisted black political participation. Efforts to restrict voting rights and limit legal protections soon appeared. Although slavery had ended, ideas of white supremacy remained deeply rooted. Reconstruction in Virginia was therefore not only about rebuilding roads and farms. It was about redefining citizenship in a society still wrestling with its past. After emancipation, black churches in Virginia became far more than places of worship. They emerged as the heart of newly freed communities. For people who had long been forced to gather in secret or sit in segregated spaces, building and governing their own churches was an act of dignity and self-determination. Denominations such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church offered structure, leadership, and a sense of collective identity rooted in faith and autonomy. Church buildings often doubled as schools. Classrooms met in sanctuaries during the week, teaching children and adults who had once been denied literacy by law. Education and faith were deeply connected. To read the Bible for oneself was both a spiritual and civic milestone. These churches also became rare, safe spaces for political discussion. In a climate where black voting rights and legal protections were contested, congregations provided networks for organizing, debating, and advocating for civil rights. Ministers frequently served as community spokesmen. Culturally, the church nurtured spirituals and the early foundations of gospel music. Songs of deliverance and hope carried forward memories of bondage while affirming freedom. Leaders such as Richard Allen and Absalom Jones demonstrated how faith could inspire activism and institution building. In this way, the black church stood at the center of Reconstruction life, shaping not only worship but education, politics, and cultural expression. As we close, I want to share something personal. Virginia in 1860 was not just a southern state. It was a central engine of a legal human trade and a powerful symbol of an extreme racial hierarchy. Yet it was also a place where African Americans forged culture, faith, and an unbreakable determination to be free. The end of slavery in 1865 did not simply shut down an economy. It began a long and unfinished struggle for citizenship, equality, and human dignity. I would truly value hearing your thoughts on this chapter of history. Please share your perspective in the comments. And if this story moved you, consider subscribing to Robert's History so we can continue exploring the past together.